Hello, everyone. Mr. Sutherland here. It feels like it's been a while since I've talked to you guys. Um, as I'm recording this, I just finished kind of grading your 9-1 quizzes that you guys took, where you were solving quadratic equations by graphing and doing some application problems with those, and you did an outstanding job with that. So what you see on the screen now is what we started this chapter with a couple weeks ago. It says here the top here, Monday, April 13th. So a little bit more than 2 weeks ago, we started solving quadratic equations. And the first method we were doing that was by graphing using calculators or Desmos. Now for the next methods, we're going to get into, so that's done. We're going to get into the algebraic method. So for these are meant to be done without any calculators or technology. It's solving a quadratic equation algebraically. So this example was here before, where we had a linear equation, and we know how to solve that algebraically, but how do we solve a quadratic equation like this algebraically without graphing it? And so the first method that we're going to use is going to be factoring. And so I'm going to come back to this problem, this exact problem in our notes, and we're going to talk about how we can solve that quadratic equation. So we go to our notes here. This is section 9.2, solving quadratic equations by factoring. Again, as you're taking notes, if I'm going too fast, please, you can slow down the video, you can pause the video, catch up. And when you're doing these problems, they're going to require just a little bit of work, but sometimes I may have you send pictures of your work so you can see that you're doing the correct method. So when we solve an equation by factoring. So let's go back to that very first problem that we had over here in our notes that we started to look at. We start looking at a linear equation. Here's a quadratic equation. So we want to know, when does x squared plus 5x plus 4 equal to 0? Now notice, anytime we do this method, the same thing always must be true. We must start the equation must be equal to 0. Kind of like when we did the graphing problems. If it wasn't equal to 0, we move things around so that it was equal to 0. So when you're solving a quadratic equation, the first thing you're going to do is set it equal to 0. Now, our method today is factoring. So let's go back to, how do you factor a quadratic? It's been a little while. Let's see if you guys remember. We have a number here and the middle number. Remember, we want to pick two numbers that multiply to be 4 and add to be 5. So if I list my factors of 4, I have 1 and 4, 2 and 2. And so the only one that adds to be 5 is 1 and 4. 2 and 2 do not. So we have our factors are x plus 1 times x plus 4 equals 0. Now, what we're going to do next is use something called the zero product property. And I'm going to write this over to the side here. So the zero product property says this. If I'm multiplying two numbers, if I multiply a times b and I get 0, then one of two things has to happen. A equals 0 or b equals 0. So what that means is, if I multiply two things and I know that they multiply to be 0, the only way I get 0 to multiply is if one of the two things are equal to 0. So how do we use that for this problem? Well, I have two things, x plus 1 and x plus 4, that I'm multiplying and they equal 0. So that means x plus 1 equals 0 or x plus 4 equals 0. And now we just solve each equation. So here, subtract 1 from both sides. I get x equals -1. Here, subtract 4 from both sides. And I get x to be -4. So this is equal to 0 at -1 or -4. And that's how I would report my answer. And if we go back to the graph like we did last time, remember these would represent the x-intercepts. We have found them algebraically. So let's try another question. So example 2. So this one, let's solve this quadratic equation. X squared minus 2x minus 8 equals 0. So the first thing I do is I check to see, is it equal to 0? And I'm just going to put a little check mark there. It tells me, yes, it's equal to 0. Now, I've got to factor this. So I need to find the numbers that multiply to be negative 8 and add to be negative 2. So if you remember when we did this, when we were together back in, this is like February or March, we wrote out all the factors, all my things that multiply to be negative 8. And I think those are the 4 pairs of numbers. Each of those multiply to be negative 8. Which of those pairs also add to be negative 2? That would be these two, 2 and negative 4. So I get rid of those. So that means my factors are x plus 2 and x minus 4 equals 0. And then once we've done that, now I just have to say, all right, x plus 2 equals 0 or x minus 4 equals 0. So subtract 2 from both sides here. So I get x to be negative 2. Here I'm going to add 4 to both sides. So I get x to be 4. So my solution set is negative 2, 4. And that's how you solve quadratic equations by factoring. So here's what I would like you to do. I'm going to put 4 practice problems on here. So what I would like you to do is solve each quadratic equation. If it's in factored form already, there's not much work to do. If it's not factored, you need to go ahead and factor it. So there's the first one, number 2. And number 3. And number 4. So pause the video, take a moment, solve these 4 quadratic equations, and then unpause the video and see how you did. Okay, let's see how you did. So with the first one is already in factored form. I don't have to do any work here. I know I have x minus 9 times 2x plus 1 equals 0. So that means for this quadratic equation, x minus 9 equals 0, or 2x plus 1 equals 0. So here I just add 9 to both sides. I get x to be 9. Here I subtract 1 from both sides. I get 2x to be negative 1. Divide by 2, and I get x to be negative 1/2. So for this one, I got 2 answers, 9 and negative 1/2. For number 2, it's not equal to 0 yet. So the first thing I need to do is add 16 to both sides. So I have x squared minus 8x plus 16 is equal to 0. So now I have it equal to 0. Now I need my factors of 16 that add to be negative 8. Well, if they multiply to be a positive and add to be a negative, that means I know they're both negative. So I've got negative 1 and negative 16, negative 2, negative 8, negative 4, negative 4. So here I have negative 4 and negative 4. So we could factor that and write that as x minus 4 times x minus 4 equals 0. And now we can shorten this. Remember, since those are the same thing, That's really just x minus 4 squared equals 0. So now when I want to solve this quadratic equation, I'm just going to make a little more space here. What I'm going to do is I just have one answer. I have x minus 4 equals 0. I don't have two different factors, so I just have to do this once, add 4 to both sides, and I get x equal to 4. And if you remember from when we did these by graphing, there were times when we had two answers and there were times when we had one answer. Those are going to be your options still. All right, let's take a look at number 3 and see how you did. So for number 3, I need the numbers that multiply to negative 21 and add to negative 4. So if I start building out my factors of 21, I believe that's it. And which of those add to be negative 4? It's going to be 3 and negative 7. So I have here x plus 3 times x minus 7 equals 0. So that means x plus 3 equals 0, or x minus 7 equals 0. On this one, I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. Over here, add 7 to both sides, and I get two answers to this quadratic equation, negative 3 or 7. And now for the final one, it's not equal to 0, so the first thing I have to do is subtract 9 from both sides. So I have x squared minus 8x minus 9 equals 0. Now my factors of negative 9 are negative 1 and 9, 1 and negative 9, negative 3 and 3. And 1 and negative 9 are the two numbers that add to be negative 8. So I have x plus 1 times x minus 9 equals 0. So x plus 1 equals 0, or x minus 9 equals 0. So I get x to be negative 1, or, so I subtract 1 from both sides, or x to be positive 9. So my answers are negative 1 and 9. So let's review. To solve a quadratic equation by factoring. Well, I'll get it so we can see all four questions. If it's already factored form, like number 1, you just set each parentheses equal to 0 and solve those equations. If they're like 2, 3, and 4, if they're like 2, 3, or 4, where they're not factored yet, you've got to make sure before you factor that they are equal to 0. You may move things around for that to happen. Then you factor each quadratic like we did earlier in the year, and then set up your two equations or sometimes one equation and solve for x. And that is how you solve by factoring. So try the homework problems tonight. We'll spend another day doing this before we move on to the next topic. Take care, everyone. Bye.